The champagne bubbled softly in my glass as I watched the clouds drift past the airplane window, 30,000 feet above the ground. In just a few hours, my life would change forever, but not in the way David expected. He sat somewhere behind, me in economy, probably cramped between strangers, while I stretched my legs in the spacious first-class cabin. The irony was delicious. For 3 years, he'd controlled our finances, made every travel decision, and reminded me constantly that luxury was something I needed to earn. Today, he would learn just how much I'd been earning all along. The flight attendant approached with another glass of Dom Pérignon, and I accepted it with a smile that held secrets David couldn't imagine. He thought he knew me, thought he'd married a simple travel planner who arranged modest vacations for middle-class families. He had no idea that the woman he'd just divorced owned the largest luxury hospitality empire in the Midwest, or that every 5-star hotel, exclusive resort, and private jet service from Chicago to Miami answered directly to me. But he was about to find out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, I had sat in our Millennium Tower condo, watching David pack his designer shirts into expensive luggage that I had purchased. The autumn light streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the diamond engagement ring on Jessica Palmer's finger as she waited by the door, her perfectly manicured hands clutching a coffee from the boutique shop downstairs. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her phone while David moved through our bedroom with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Sarah, I want you to know this isn't about you not being enough," David said, his voice carrying that practiced sincerity he'd perfected during his years in marketing. He folded another shirt, one I'd bought him for his birthday just 6 months ago. "Jessica and we just connect on a different level. She understands my ambitions." I nodded quietly from my position on the velvet armchair near the window, the same chair where I'd spent countless evenings reviewing quarterly reports, while David assumed I was reading romance novels. The performance required careful calibration. Too much emotion would seem suspicious. Too little would make me appear cold. I'd been preparing for this moment longer than David realized. "I understand," I replied softly, letting just the right amount of resignation color my voice. "You need someone who can match your success." Jessica shifted uncomfortably near the doorway. Despite her role in destroying my marriage, she wasn't entirely heartless. The guilt flickered across her face whenever our eyes met, though she quickly looked away. She probably told herself she was doing me a favor, freeing me from a man who no longer loved me. If only she knew the truth about what she was really getting. David continued packing, his movements efficient and cold. "The lawyers will handle everything fairly. I'm not going to leave you with nothing, Sarah. The condo will need to be sold, of course, but you'll get your share. And I'll make sure you have enough to find a nice little place somewhere." A nice little place. The condescension dripped from his words like honey from a broken jar. David had always spoken to me this way, as if I was a child who needed his guidance to navigate the world. During our 5-year marriage, he'd gradually taken control of our finances, our social life, our future plans. He made the investment decisions, chose our vacation destinations, and selected which restaurants we could afford. I'd let him, playing the role of the grateful wife who appreciated his business acumen. What David didn't know was that every dollar he'd invested, every business connection he'd made, every opportunity that had advanced his career at Palmer & Associates Marketing had been carefully orchestrated by me. The promotion that had doubled his salary 2 years ago came after I'd steered a major client to his firm. The exclusive membership at the Chicago Athletic Club that he'd bragged about to his friends had been arranged through my connections. Even Jessica's interest in him hadn't been entirely organic. I had been testing him, watching to see what success would do to his character. The results had been disappointing but not surprising. Power had revealed who David truly was underneath the charming exterior, and what I'd discovered was a man whose love was conditional on what he perceived as my limitations. "Where will you be living?" I asked, maintaining my role as the concerned ex-wife. "Jessica's Aunt Grace has offered us her guest house in Naperville while we look for something." "Permanent," David replied, zipping his suitcase with satisfaction. "It's quite generous of her. Grace owns several properties around the area, very successful in real estate development." I almost smiled at that. Grace Palmer was indeed successful in real estate, though not in the way David imagined. She was one of my subsidiary managers, overseeing residential properties for Mitchell Hospitality Holdings. The guest house David would be staying in was actually owned by my company, though the paperwork was buried deep enough that it would take a forensic accountant to trace it back to me. Grace had been playing her role perfectly, allowing David and Jessica to believe she was the wealthy aunt who would secure their future. "That sounds wonderful," I said, standing to help him with his bags. "I'm happy you'll be comfortable." David paused at the door, Jessica already in the hallway, and looked back at me with something that might have been regret. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind, might realize what he was walking away from. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and offered me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll be fine, Sarah. You're stronger than you think. Maybe this will be good for both of us. A chance for you to discover who you really are without me." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. David had no idea who I really was, had never bothered to look beneath the surface of the woman he'd married. He saw what he wanted to see, a modest travel planner who needed his guidance, who was grateful for his attention, who would never be ambitious enough to challenge his sense of superiority. After they left, I stood alone in our condo, surrounded by the furniture and artwork I'd selected, in the home I'd purchased, looking out at the city where I employed thousands of people, who had no idea their ultimate boss was a quiet woman who let her ex-husband believe he was the breadwinner. The silence was profound, but not empty. It was full of possibility. I walked to my home office, the room David rarely entered because he assumed it contained nothing more important than vacation itineraries and client thank you cards. Behind a false panel in the wall, I retrieved the files I'd been preparing for months. Legal documents, financial statements, and strategic plans that would reshape David's understanding of reality. Everything was ready for the revelation that would come when the time was right. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert Chen, my chief operations officer, and the only person who knew the full extent of my corporate identity. "The Palmer situation is progressing as expected. David's performance review at the marketing firm has been scheduled for next month. Should we proceed with the next phase?" I typed back quickly. "Not yet. Let him settle into his new life first. I want him to feel completely secure before we begin." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The plan I'd been developing required patience and precise timing. David needed to believe he'd won, that leaving me had been the smartest decision of his life. He needed to feel superior, successful, and confident in his choice. Only then would the reversal have the impact I intended. Over the next several weeks, I maintained the illusion perfectly. David would call occasionally to check on me, his voice filled with the patronizing concern of a man who believed he was dealing with a fragile ex-wife. I played my part beautifully, mentioning my struggles to find affordable housing, my concerns about making ends meet on my travel planning income, my gratitude for his patience during the divorce proceedings. "I found a small place in Lincoln Park," I told him during one of these calls. "Nothing fancy, but it has good light and it's close to the train." "That sounds perfect for you," David replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He probably felt validated in his decision, convinced that I was exactly the limited person he'd believed me to be. Jessica and I have been looking at some beautiful homes in the suburbs. Her Aunt Grace has been showing us some amazing properties." I smiled, knowing exactly which properties he meant. Grace had been instructed to show them only the most expensive homes, the ones that would require David to stretch his finances to the breaking point. He would need to believe that Jessica's family connections could make such luxury possible, that leaving me had opened doors to a lifestyle he could never have achieved otherwise. The divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising smoothness. David's lawyer seemed almost apologetic about how little I was asking for, but I assured them I only wanted what was fair. I accepted a modest settlement, asked for no alimony, and agreed to sell the condo with the proceeds split evenly. David couldn't believe his good fortune. He'd expected a battle, prepared for demands and negotiations, but I simply wanted to move on with my life. What he didn't realize was that the condo sale would net me exactly nothing that I hadn't already owned. The mortgage had been paid through one of my subsidiary companies, the down payment had come from my personal accounts, and the marital assets he thought we were splitting had always been mine. I was essentially buying my own property from myself, but the paperwork made it appear as though David was being incredibly generous to his struggling ex-wife. Meanwhile, Jessica settled into her new role as David's girlfriend, with the enthusiasm of someone who believed she'd won the lottery. She quit her job as his secretary and began spending her days decorating Grace's guest house and planning their future together. David posted photos on social media of their romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and shopping trips, each image carefully curated to show his followers how much better his life had become. I watched it all from my modest Lincoln Park apartment, a 2-bedroom space I'd decorated to look appropriately humble. The real irony was that this apartment was located in a building I owned, on a block where I controlled 3/4 of the commercial real estate. Every morning, I would leave this deliberately modest space and take the train downtown to my real office, 60 floors above the city, where I would spend my days running an empire David couldn't imagine. The Mitchell Hospitality Holdings building didn't bear my name, of course. The corporate structure was complex enough that even business journalists who tried to investigate the company's ownership found themselves lost in a maze of holding companies, investment groups, and international partnerships. As far as the public knew, the CEO was a reclusive figure who preferred to operate through intermediaries and rarely made public appearances. Robert Chen served as my public face when necessary, attending board meetings and industry conferences while I remained in the shadows. He'd been with me since the beginning, when I'd started with a single bed and breakfast in Wisconsin that I'd purchased with my inheritance from my grandmother. Over 15 years, we'd built that small property into a hospitality empire that owned luxury hotels, exclusive resorts, private jet services, and boutique travel agencies across the Midwest and Southeast. The irony was that David had unknowingly been helping me expand the business throughout our marriage. His marketing expertise, which I'd guided and directed without him realizing it, had been instrumental in developing the brand strategies that made our properties so successful. Every campaign he'd created, every client relationship he'd built, every industry connection he'd made had ultimately served my company's interests. Now, sitting in my real office reviewing the quarterly reports, that showed record profits across all divisions, I was ready to begin the next phase of my plan. David had settled into his new life. Jessica was planning their future together, and both of them believed they understood the rules of the game they were playing. They had no idea that I'd been writing those rules all along. The morning I'd been waiting for finally arrived with a phone call from Robert. "David's performance review is scheduled for this afternoon," he reported. "Mark Stevens is prepared to deliver the news as discussed." Mark Stevens, David's boss at Palmer & Associates. Marketing had been getting his instructions from me for years without knowing it. The marketing firm had been struggling financially when I'd begun steering major clients their way, and Mark had been grateful for the sudden influx of business. He had no idea that the mysterious benefactor who'd saved his company was the quiet, wife of one of his employees. "And the travel arrangements?" I asked, reviewing the itinerary Robert had sent me. "The flight to Los Angeles is booked as requested. David and Jessica are in seats 24C and 24D. Your seat is 2A. First class, of course." It was time for David to see exactly who he'd been married to, and there was no better place for that revelation than 30,000 feet in the air, where he couldn't escape, couldn't deny what was happening, and couldn't avoid confronting the reality of what he'd thrown away. I'd planned every detail of this moment, from the timing of his work crisis to the seating arrangements on the plane. David would board thinking he was flying to Los Angeles to save his career, to meet with a potential client who could rescue his failing performance at Palmer and Associates. He had no idea that the client was actually one of my subsidiary companies, that the meeting was entirely fictional, and that by the time the plane landed, his understanding of his entire life would be fundamentally altered. The call came at exactly 3:47 p.m. David's voice was strained, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "Sarah, I need your help." The desperation in David's voice was music to my ears, though I kept my tone carefully neutral as I answered his call. "What's wrong, David?" "It's work," he said, and I could hear Jessica's concerned murmurs in the background. "Mark called me into his office today. Our biggest client is threatening to pull their account unless I can fix what they're calling a fundamental breach of creative vision. I have to fly to Los Angeles tomorrow morning to meet with them personally." I made appropriately sympathetic sounds while reviewing the file Robert had prepared. The crisis at Palmer and Associates had been carefully orchestrated over the past month, with one of my subsidiary companies playing the role of the dissatisfied client. David had no idea that the account he was desperately trying to save represented nearly 40% of his firm's revenue, or that losing it would likely result in his termination. "That sounds stressful," I said, settling into my Lincoln Park apartment's modest kitchen chair. Through the window, I could see the Chicago skyline twinkling in the distance, every light representing lives and dreams and ambitions that intersected with my business empire in ways they'd never know. "Is Jessica going with you?" She insisted. "On coming for moral support," David replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "But Sarah, the thing is, we're having cash flow issues. The house we want to put an offer on requires a significant down payment, and with Jessica not working anymore, money's been tighter than expected." I almost laughed at the irony. David was about to ask his supposedly struggling ex-wife for financial help, the same woman he'd left because he thought she wasn't ambitious enough to match his success. "What do you need, David?" "Could you possibly loan us the money for the plane tickets? I know it's awkward asking you, but this meeting could save my career. I'll pay you back as soon as we get home, I promise." The beautiful thing about this moment was that David genuinely believed he was asking for help from someone who could barely afford it. In his mind, I was scraping together my modest travel planning income, living paycheck to paycheck in my small apartment, probably agonizing over whether I could spare a few $100s for his emergency. "Of course," I said without hesitation. "How much do you need?" $800 should cover both tickets if we book coach," David said, relief flooding his voice. "Sarah, I can't tell you how much this means to me. I know things ended badly between us, but you're really saving my life here." I transferred the money immediately, using my personal account rather than any of my business ones. The transaction was pocket change to me, but I knew David would interpret it as a significant sacrifice from his financially struggling ex-wife. The guilt would eat at him, which was exactly what I wanted. "The money should be in your account within the hour," I told him. "Good luck with your meeting, David. I hope everything works out." After ending the call, I immediately contacted Robert to confirm the final arrangements. "David and Jessica will be on United Flight 447 tomorrow morning," I informed him. "Make sure the Los Angeles team knows to expect them for the 2 p.m. meeting that will never happen." "Already handled," Robert replied. The hotel reservations are confirmed, the rental car is arranged, and the contact information David has been given leads to a voicemail box that will remain perpetually full. He'll spend the entire day trying to reach a client who doesn't exist. The elegance of the plan was in its simplicity. David would arrive in Los Angeles convinced that his career depended on a meeting that had been fabricated entirely for my purposes. While he ran around the city desperately trying to salvage his professional life, I would be revealing the truth about mine in the most dramatic way possible. That evening, I stood in my real office 60 floors above Chicago, watching the city. Lights twinkle below while I finalized the details that would change everything. The Mitchell Hospitality Holdings empire spread out beneath me like a glittering constellation. Each property and subsidiary a star in a network that David had never suspected existed. My assistant, Maria Santos, knocked softly on the door before entering with the travel documents I'd requested. Maria was one of the few people who knew my complete story, having worked for me since the early days when we were building the company from a single property into an industry powerhouse. "Your first-class ticket is confirmed for tomorrow morning," Maria said, placing the boarding pass on my desk. "Seat 2A as requested. The timing should be perfect for maximum impact." I picked up the boarding pass, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. For years, I'd lived a double life, playing the role of the modest travel planner while secretly building one of the most successful hospitality companies in the country. David had been so convinced of my limitations that he'd never bothered to look deeper, never questioned how I managed to stay so calm during our financial discussions or how I always seemed to know exactly the right travel connections to help his clients. "The media strategy is prepared?" I asked, reviewing the press release that would go out after the revelation. "Everything's ready," Maria confirmed. "The business journals have been briefed on the embargo. The story will break 48 hours after your Los Angeles trip, giving you time to handle the immediate fallout privately." The press release would reveal the identity of Mitchell Hospitality Holdings' mysterious CEO for the first time, complete with photos and a detailed biography that would shock everyone who thought they knew Sarah Mitchell. David's name wouldn't be mentioned directly, but anyone who knew our history would be able to piece together the implications. I walked to the wall of windows that made up the entire eastern face of my office, looking out over the city that had become my empire's headquarters. Somewhere down there, David was probably lying awake next to Jessica, anxious about tomorrow's flight and the meeting that would determine his future. He had no idea that his future had already been decided, that every step he'd taken since leaving me had been guided by my invisible hand. The irony was that David could have been part of this empire legitimately. When I'd first started expanding the business during our marriage, I'd hoped that success would bring us closer together, that sharing my achievements with him would strengthen our relationship. Instead, his growing arrogance and condescension had shown me exactly what kind of man I'd married. The test had been subtle but revealing. As my business grew and the profits increased, I'd begun sharing more of the financial decisions with David, letting him believe his marketing expertise was driving our personal wealth. I'd watched carefully to see how he would handle success, whether prosperity would make him more generous or more selfish, more humble or more arrogant. The results had been devastating. The more successful David became, the more he diminished me. He began making decisions without consulting me, spending money without discussion, and treating my opinions as irrelevant. He started introducing me at social events as just a travel planner, while positioning himself as the ambitious one, the breadwinner, the person with real business sense. The final straw had come 6 months ago at a charity gala I'd sponsored, anonymously through one of my foundations. David had been holding court with a group of other businessmen, bragging about his latest marketing campaign while I stood nearby, invisible in the way that wives often become at such events. "The secret to success," David had said, gesturing with his wine glass while completely ignoring my presence, "is knowing when to cut dead weight. Sometimes you have to make hard choices about who deserves to be part of your journey to the top." He'd been talking about firing an underperforming employee, but the words had cut through me like a blade. At that moment, I'd realized that David saw me as dead weight too, someone who was holding him back from achieving his full potential. The divorce papers I'd filed the next morning had been the beginning of his education about just how wrong he'd been. Now, standing in my office with tomorrow's revelation just hours away, I felt a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Part of me had hoped that David would surprise me, that losing me would make him realize what he'd taken for granted. Instead, his behavior during our separation had confirmed every disappointment I'd harbored about his character. My phone buzzed with a text message from Grace Palmer, Jessica's supposed wealthy aunt, who was actually one of my property managers. D and J are settled in the guest house. He's been on the phone all evening trying to prepare for tomorrow's meeting. Jay seems nervous about something, keeps asking questions about our family's finances. I smiled at that detail. Jessica was beginning to sense that something wasn't quite right with her fairy tale romance. The wealthy aunt's generosity was starting to feel too convenient. The guest house accommodations were more luxurious than she'd expected, and David's sudden career crisis had emerged from nowhere, just as they were planning their future together. Smart girl. If she'd been a little smarter 6 months ago, she might have asked more questions before getting involved with a married man. But then again, David could be very convincing when he wanted something, and Jessica had been dazzled by his promises of the life they'd build together. I opened my laptop and reviewed the final details of tomorrow's orchestration. The timing had to be perfect. David's flight would board at 8:15 a.m. from gate B7. I would board first, of course, as a first-class passenger, and be comfortably settled, with a glass of champagne by the time David and Jessica made their way to their economy seats. The real beauty of the plan was in what would happen during the flight. David would spend the entire journey reviewing his presentation materials, psyching himself up for the meeting that would save his career, while I sat just a few rows ahead of him, invisible behind the first-class curtain. He would have no idea that his fate was literally within arm's reach. The revelation would come during the meal service, when I would make my way to the restroom and deliberately pass through the economy cabin. David's shock at seeing me in first class would be compounded by his confusion about how I could afford such luxury. The questions would multiply throughout the rest of the flight, building to a crescendo that would prepare him perfectly for what he'd discover in Los Angeles. By the time we landed, David would be primed for the truth, his assumptions shattered, and his reality fundamentally altered. The meeting he was flying to attend would turn out to be a mirage, but the education he'd receive would be very real indeed. I closed my laptop and gathered my things, preparing to leave the office that David had never seen, the empire he'd never suspected, the life I'd built while he was busy underestimating me. Tomorrow would be the beginning of his real education, about the woman he'd married and the opportunities he'd thrown away. The elevator descended silently toward the parking garage where my driver waited with the car David had never known I owned. As we pulled into Chicago traffic, I thought about all the nights I'd returned to our Millennium Tower condo after days, spent running a multi-million-dollar empire, only to have David lecture me about the importance of ambition and the need to think bigger about my modest travel planning business. If he'd only known that his ambitious wife was sitting right beside him the entire time, quietly building the future he claimed to want, while he chased illusions of success that were always just beyond his reach. Tomorrow, David would finally meet the real Sarah Mitchell, and the encounter would change both of our lives forever. Part 3. The morning of the flight dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made Chicago's skyline gleam like polished steel. I woke in my Lincoln Park apartment at 5 a.m., not from anxiety but from anticipation. Today was the day David would begin to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. I dressed carefully for the occasion, selecting a tailored business suit that managed to look both expensive and understated. The kind of outfit that would read as successful professional, to fellow first-class passengers while appearing inexplicably luxurious to someone who believed I lived paycheck to paycheck. Every detail mattered today, from my perfectly styled hair to the understated jewelry that cost more than David's monthly salary. My phone showed a text message from Jessica, sent at 6:47 a.m. "Thank you again for helping with the tickets. David's so stressed about this meeting. You're being incredibly generous considering everything." The guilt in her message was palpable. Jessica was beginning to realize that her role in destroying my marriage might have been based on false assumptions about David's character and circumstances. The wealthy life she'd expected was proving more elusive than promised, and now she was watching her boyfriend accept charity from the ex-wife she'd helped him abandon. I typed back quickly. "Happy to help. I hope everything works out." Simple, gracious, with just enough magnanimity to twist the knife of her conscience a little deeper. Robert called as I finished my coffee. "Final confirmation on all arrangements," he reported. "David's meeting appointments in Los Angeles will lead nowhere. The hotel reservations are confirmed, and our LA team is prepared to maintain the illusion for as long as necessary." And the press strategy? Media embargo holds until Thursday morning. That gives you today and tomorrow to handle the personal fallout before the business world learns about your public reveal. I smiled at the thought of David trying to explain to his colleagues and friends how his supposedly struggling ex-wife had turned out to be one of the most successful hospitality executives in the country. The social implications alone would keep him awake for weeks. The ride to O'Hare was smooth and quiet, my driver navigating the morning traffic with practiced efficiency. As we approached the airport, I could see planes ascending and descending against the pale blue sky, each one carrying passengers toward destinations and revelations they couldn't yet imagine. In a few hours, David and Jessica would be aboard one of those aircraft, hurtling toward a truth that would fundamentally alter their understanding of reality. I arrived at the airport 90 minutes before departure, giving myself plenty of time to check in, clear security, and settle into the first-class lounge. The United Club was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few business travelers reviewing presentations over coffee and pastries. I found a quiet corner table with a clear view of the departure screens and opened my laptop to review the quarterly reports that had arrived overnight. Mitchell Hospitality Holdings had posted record profits again, with occupancy rates exceeding 90% across all properties and 3 new luxury resorts scheduled to open before the end of the year. The private jet division had expanded into international markets, and our boutique travel planning services were booked solid through the following spring. It was an empire that had grown from my grandmother's small bed and breakfast into a multi-billion-dollar operation, and David had been completely oblivious to all of it. At 7:30, I spotted them through the lounge's floor-to-ceiling windows. David walked quickly through the terminal, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and his expression focused, with the intensity of a man whose career hung in the balance. Jessica struggled to keep up with his pace, wheeling her small suitcase while constantly checking her phone for updates about their gate assignment. They looked like exactly what they were: 2 people in economy class trying to make an important flight on someone else's dime. David wore his second-best suit, the one he'd purchased at a department store sale rather than the designer original he preferred. Jessica had chosen an outfit that was trying too hard to look professional. Complete, with accessories that screamed borrowed money to anyone who knew how to read the signs. I watched them locate their gate and settle into the uncomfortable chairs near the departure area. David immediately pulled out his laptop and began reviewing what I knew were presentation materials for a meeting that would never happen. Jessica browsed through a magazine, but I could see her stealing glances at David's screen, trying to understand the crisis that had necessitated this expensive trip. My phone buzzed with a message from Grace Palmer. They left the guest house at 6 a.m. Dee was up all night preparing. Jay asked me again about our family's hotel investments. Getting suspicious. Perfect. Jessica's intuition was sharpening at exactly the right moment. By the time we landed in Los Angeles, she'd be primed to start asking the kinds of questions that would accelerate David's realization that nothing in his new life was quite what it seemed. At 7:45, the first-class boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I gathered my belongings and made my way to the gate, where the flight attendants greeted me with the warm professionalism reserved for premium passengers. The first-class cabin was spacious and quiet, with only 8 other passengers settling into their leather seats. I took my assigned seat in 2A, directly behind the cockpit with an unobstructed view of the cabin entry. From this vantage point, I would see David and Jessica when they boarded, though they wouldn't immediately notice me tucked away in the front section. The flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne, which I accepted with a smile that contained all the satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. 20 minutes later, the general boarding announcement began. I watched through the first-class cabin's entrance as economy passengers began streaming aboard. A river of humanity carrying bags and hopes and destinations. David and Jessica appeared in the queue about halfway through the process. David still, clutching his laptop case like a lifeline while Jessica looked around nervously at the airplane's interior. They passed within 3 feet of my seat as they made their way toward the back of the plane, but neither looked in my direction. The first-class section might as well have been invisible to them, separated by social expectations and economic assumptions that made it inconceivable that Sarah Mitchell could be sitting there with a glass of Dom Pérignon and a view of the clouds. I heard David's voice as they found their seats in row 24. "This is it, Jess. Everything depends on how this meeting goes. If I can convince them to keep the account, we're set. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. David was pinning his hopes on a fictional meeting, while the real power that could save or destroy his career sat just 20 rows in front of him, hidden behind a first-class curtain and a lifetime of his own assumptions about who I was. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. For 5 years, I'd played the role David needed me to play. The supportive wife who admired his ambition, the modest travel planner who was grateful for his business acumen, the woman who made him feel important and successful and superior. The performance had been flawless because it served my purposes. While David focused on climbing the corporate ladder at Palmer & Associates, I was building something infinitely larger and more significant. His small victories in marketing campaigns became the foundation for my expansion into new markets. His networking events provided connections I could leverage for major deals. His salary increases funded investments that generated returns he couldn't imagine. Every time David had bragged about his latest success, he'd been unknowingly describing my achievements. Every time he'd dismissed my business as small-scale or cute, he'd been revealing his complete ignorance of the empire I was constructing around him. Every time he'd suggested I should be more ambitious, I'd smiled and nodded while reviewing profit reports from companies he didn't know I owned. The plane reached cruising altitude as I was served a meal that probably cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. Through the cabin divider, I could hear fragments of his conversation with Jessica as he continued rehearsing for the meeting that awaited him in Los Angeles. "The key is showing them we understand their vision," David was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he was in control of his destiny. "This isn't just about marketing campaigns. It's about building their brand identity from the ground up." I almost laughed at the irony. David was preparing to pitch brand identity strategies to a company that existed solely as part of my business empire, created specifically to teach him this lesson about the difference between real power and the illusion of success. The flight attendant approached my seat with a subtle question about whether I'd like another glass of champagne. I accepted, knowing that in about 30 minutes I would need to use the restroom, which would require walking through the economy cabin where David and Jessica were seated. That moment would be the first crack in David's reality, the initial suggestion that perhaps his understanding of our situation wasn't as complete as he'd believed. The shock of seeing me in first class would plant questions that would multiply throughout the rest of the flight, preparing him for the larger revelations that awaited in Los Angeles. I sipped my champagne and watched the clouds drift past the window, thinking about how different this flight would be from David's perspective. He was flying toward what he believed was the most important meeting of his career, carrying the hopes and dreams of his new life with Jessica, funded by the generosity of an ex-wife he'd convinced himself was barely scraping by. In reality, he was flying toward the complete destruction of every assumption he'd made about success, power, and the woman he'd been married to for 5 years. The meeting he was so desperate to attend would never happen, but the education he was about to receive would be worth far more than any marketing contract. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing our descent into Los Angeles airspace. It was time to shatter David's illusions and show him exactly what he'd walked away from when he decided that Jessica Palmer and her wealthy family connections were a better bet than Sarah Mitchell and her modest travel planning business. I finished my champagne and prepared for the performance of a lifetime. Part 4. The moment I had orchestrated for months arrived with the soft chime of the seatbelt sign being turned off. I waited precisely 15 minutes after reaching cruising altitude, allowing David and Jessica to settle into their cramped economy seats and begin their in-flight routine, before rising gracefully from my first-class seat and making my way toward the rear of the aircraft. The economy cabin was a stark contrast to the spacious comfort I'd just left behind. Passengers were squeezed into narrow seats, juggling laptops on tray tables barely large enough to hold a magazine, while flight attendants navigated the cramped aisles with practiced efficiency. The air was thick with the competing scents of airline coffee, microwaved meals, and the subtle tension of people trapped in an uncomfortable space for hours. I walked slowly down the aisle, my designer heels clicking softly against the aircraft's floor. My tailored suit a striking contrast to the casual travel wear worn by most economy passengers. Several people glanced up as I passed, perhaps wondering why someone dressed for a boardroom was walking through their section of the plane. David was in the middle of explaining something to Jessica when I approached row 24, his laptop balanced precariously on his tray table, presentation slides glowing on the screen. He was gesturing with the intensity of a man whose future depended on the meeting he was preparing for, completely absorbed in his material and oblivious to his surroundings. "The key demographic analysis shows," David was saying, then stopped mid-sentence as I appeared in his peripheral vision. The transformation on his face was worth every month of careful planning. His expression shifted from focused concentration to confusion to shock to something approaching disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "Sarah?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, David," I replied with a warm smile, as if encountering my ex-husband in the economy section of a cross-country flight was the most natural thing in the world. "What a lovely surprise." Jessica looked up from her magazine, and I watched her face cycle through similar emotions. First confusion at seeing a woman in expensive business attire chatting with her boyfriend, then recognition as she realized who I was, then bewilderment as she tried to reconcile my appearance with her assumptions about my financial situation. What are you doing here?" David stammered, his laptop forgotten as he struggled to understand the scenario unfolding before him. "Flying to Los Angeles," I answered pleasantly. "Business meeting. You know how it is." David's eyes traveled from my obviously expensive suit to my perfectly styled hair to the subtle but unmistakable signs of luxury that surrounded me like an aura. The watch on my wrist cost more than his monthly rent. The handbag tucked under. My arm was from a designer boutique he'd browsed but never purchased from. Even my shoes suggested a level of disposable income that contradicted everything he believed about my circumstances. "But how?" Jessica began, then stopped herself, perhaps realizing that any question she asked would reveal her own confusion about the situation. "How lovely that you're both traveling together," I continued. maintaining my gracious tone while David's world quietly imploded around him. "Are you visiting Los Angeles for pleasure?" David's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to respond. "Business meeting, important client." "How wonderful," I said, genuinely meaning it in ways he couldn't understand. "I hope it goes well for you." The flight attendant was approaching with a beverage cart, forcing me to step aside. "Well, I should let you get back to your preparations," I told David, whose eyes were still fixed on me with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Enjoy the rest of your flight." I walked back toward first class, feeling the weight of David's stare following me up the aisle. Behind me, I could hear the urgent whispers beginning immediately. "How is she flying first class?" Jessica's voice was quiet, but audible to anyone paying attention. "I don't know," David replied, his own voice tight with confusion. She said she was struggling financially. She's living in that tiny apartment in Lincoln Park. Her travel business barely makes ends meet. "David, that suit she's wearing costs more than most people's car payments." I know, but there has to be an explanation. Maybe she's using credit cards. Maybe she's trying to impress a client. Maybe. His voice trailed off as the impossibility of his rationalizations became apparent even to him. I settled back into my first-class seat with deep satisfaction, knowing that the questions multiplying in David's mind would consume his attention for the remainder of the flight. The flight attendant offered me another glass of champagne, which I accepted while reviewing the messages that had accumulated on my phone during the brief encounter. Robert had confirmed that the Los Angeles arrangements were proceeding as planned, with David's fictional client maintaining complete radio silence despite his increasingly desperate attempts to confirm the meeting. Grace Palmer had texted an update about Jessica's growing suspicions. Jay called this morning asking specific questions about our hotel properties. Wanted to know exact locations and how long we've owned them. Getting harder to maintain the cover story. Perfect timing. Jessica's intuition was sharpening, just as David's certainty was crumbling. By the time we landed in Los Angeles, both of them would be primed for the revelations that awaited. I opened my laptop and reviewed the presentation I would be giving to my actual business associates later that afternoon. Mitchell Hospitality Holdings was finalizing the acquisition of a boutique hotel chain on the West Coast, a deal that would expand our presence in the California market significantly. The irony wasn't lost on me that while David chased phantom meetings, I would be conducting real business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. From economy class, I could hear David's voice becoming increasingly agitated as he tried to focus on his presentation materials while wrestling with the questions my appearance had raised. His laptop keyboard clicked frantically as he presumably tried to research explanations for what he'd witnessed. "Maybe she got upgraded," I heard Jessica suggest, though her tone indicated she didn't believe her own theory. "You don't get upgraded wearing clothes like that unless you're already flying first class regularly," David replied, his marketing background giving him enough insight into luxury branding to recognize authenticity when he saw it. The conversation continued in hushed, urgent tones throughout the flight, with David and Jessica constructing and demolishing theories about my presence in first class. Each explanation they developed collapsed under logical scrutiny, leaving them more confused and suspicious than before. As we began our descent into Los Angeles, I could see David pacing in the narrow aisle near his seat, his phone pressed to his ear as he made increasingly frantic calls to confirm his afternoon meeting. From my position in first class, I could hear fragments of his conversations with receptionists who had been instructed to be politely unhelpful. "I'm calling to confirm my 2 p.m. meeting with Mr. Richardson. No, I don't have a confirmation number. Yes, I'll hold." Each call ended with deeper frustration as David encountered obstacles that seemed designed to prevent him from reaching his crucial client, which, of course, they were. The plane touched down at LAX with the gentle bump that signaled the end of our journey and the beginning of David's real education. As we taxied toward the gate, I gathered my belongings, and prepared for the next phase of the revelation that would complete his understanding of the mistake he'd made. First-class passengers disembarked ahead of the general boarding groups, which meant I would be long gone from the aircraft by the time David and Jessica made their way off the plane. They would spend the ride to their hotel theorizing about my mysterious presence, building toward conclusions that would prepare them perfectly for what they would discover about the meeting David had flown across the country to attend. I stepped off the plane into the bright Los Angeles sunshine, my driver already waiting with a luxury sedan that would take me to the real business meeting that David's fictional appointment had been designed to camouflage. As we pulled away from the airport, I caught a glimpse of David and Jessica emerging from the terminal, David still clutching his laptop case while consulting his phone for directions to a meeting that would never happen. The beautiful thing about truth is that it emerges inevitably, regardless of how carefully we construct our illusions. David had spent months believing he understood the rules of the game he was playing, convinced that leaving me had positioned him for greater success with Jessica and her wealthy family connections. He had no idea that every move he'd made had been anticipated. Every assumption he'd held had been carefully cultivated, and every advantage he thought he'd gained had been provided by the woman he'd dismissed as too limited to share his ambitious future. The education that awaited him in Los Angeles would be comprehensive and unforgettable. By the time he returned to Chicago, David would understand exactly what he'd lost when he decided that Sarah Mitchell wasn't successful enough to deserve his continued love and loyalty. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones we never see coming. Part 5. The Beverly Hills Hotel's lobby was exactly the kind of place where real business happened, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers and the quiet hum of serious money-changing hands. I sat in a leather armchair near the concierge desk, ostensibly reviewing documents on my tablet while actually monitoring the text updates that tracked David's increasingly desperate afternoon in Los Angeles. My actual business meeting had concluded successfully an hour earlier, with Mitchell Hospitality Holdings officially acquiring Pacific Coast luxury resorts for a sum that would have made David's fictional marketing contract look like pocket change. The 3-hour negotiation had been conducted in a private dining room overlooking the hotel's famous pool, where I demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and financial acumen that David had never suspected I possessed. Now I was waiting for the final act of his education to unfold, watching the lobby for his inevitable arrival as his phantom meeting dissolved into the reality of his situation. My phone buzzed with an update from Robert. David has been calling the Richardson Industries number for 2 hours. Our automated system has him in a loop that will never connect him to a real person. Jessica is getting suspicious about the hotel reservations that seem too expensive for their budget. I smiled at that detail. The hotel where David and Jessica were staying was actually one of my properties, booked through a subsidiary that offered apparent discounts to make the luxury accommodations seem affordable. David probably thought Jessica's wealthy aunt had arranged special rates, not realizing that every aspect of his Los Angeles experience was being orchestrated by his ex-wife. The lobby's atmosphere was perfectly suited for what was about to happen. Business travelers moved through the space with purpose, their expensive luggage and confident demeanor creating the backdrop of success that David aspired to but had never genuinely achieved. The contrast with his current situation would be particularly stark when he finally arrived. At 4:17 p.m., I spotted them through the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows. David walked quickly across the courtyard, his phone pressed to his ear and his expression increasingly frantic. Jessica trailed behind him, her earlier enthusiasm for the trip replaced by obvious concern about their deteriorating circumstances. They entered the lobby like two people who had stumbled into a world they didn't quite belong in. David's department. Store suit looked shabby against the backdrop of genuine luxury, while Jessica's attempt at professional attire seemed costume-like compared to the effortless elegance of the hotel's other guests. I watched from my concealed position as David approached the concierge desk, his voice carrying clearly across the marble space, despite his attempt to speak quietly. "I'm trying to reach Richardson Industries about a meeting that was scheduled for this afternoon," he said to the perfectly groomed concierge. I've been calling all day but can't get through to anyone." The concierge's expression was politely sympathetic. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not familiar with that company. Perhaps you could provide me with an address or additional contact information?" David's face flushed as he realized he had no additional information to provide. The entire meeting had been arranged through intermediaries, with contact details that led nowhere and confirmation numbers that didn't exist in any real system. "This is impossible," David muttered, stepping away from the desk while Jessica watched with growing alarm. The meeting was confirmed. The contract is worth millions. They can't just disappear. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of David's world collapsing in real time. The confidence that had carried him through the flight was evaporating, as the reality of his situation became undeniable. He wasn't in Los Angeles for a crucial business meeting. He was chasing shadows created by someone who understood his weaknesses better than he understood them himself. Jessica placed a tentative hand on his arm. "David, maybe we should call Sarah. She might have some ideas about what to do." The irony of that suggestion was exquisite. Jessica was recommending that David contact his supposedly struggling ex-wife for business advice while standing in a lobby that I owned, having flown to Los Angeles on tickets I'd paid for to attend a meeting I'd fabricated. "Call Sarah?" David's voice was sharp with frustration. What could she possibly know about this situation? She plans budget vacations for middle-class families. This is corporate-level business. I chose that moment to stand and approach them, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the authority of someone who belonged in this environment. David and Jessica turned toward the sound, their expressions shifting from confusion to recognition to complete bewilderment. "Having trouble with your meeting?" I asked pleasantly, as if encountering them in the Beverly Hills hotel lobby was a delightful coincidence, rather than the culmination of months of careful planning. David stared at me as if I were a mirage that might disappear if he blinked hard. "Enough." "Sarah, what? How are you here?" "I told you on the plane," I replied with a gentle smile. "Business meeting. Mine went very well, actually. I'm sorry to hear yours is presenting challenges." Jessica found her voice first. "You were on our plane?" "First class," I confirmed, watching David's face cycle through emotions too complex for him to process. "Lovely flight. The champagne service was exceptional." The implications of that simple statement hit David like a physical blow. First-class tickets cost more than he made in a month. The silence that followed my casual mention of first-class champagne stretched between us like a chasm opening in the Beverly Hills Hotel's marble floor. David's mouth moved soundlessly while Jessica stared at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together in any logical way. "First class," David finally repeated, his voice hollow. "You flew first class." I confirmed, adjusting my handbag with the kind of casual gesture that comes from handling expensive accessories daily. The seat was quite comfortable, much better than my usual arrangements. That was a lie, of course. First class was my usual arrangement, had been for years as I traveled between my properties and conducted business across the country. But David didn't need to know that yet. The revelation needed to unfold gradually, each piece of information building on the last until the complete picture became undeniable. Jessica's eyes were sharp as she studied my appearance more carefully than she had on the airplane. The designer suit, the Italian leather shoes, the subtle but unmistakable signs of wealth that David had somehow missed during 5 years of marriage were now impossible to ignore in the bright afternoon light streaming through the hotel's windows. "Sarah," Jessica said carefully, "that suit you're wearing. Do you like it?" I asked, smoothing the fabric with genuine pleasure. "It's new. I had it tailored last week for this trip." The word tailored hung in the air like an accusation. Custom tailoring wasn't something someone living paycheck to paycheck invested in for business meetings. It was the kind of luxury that suggested a level of disposable income that made David's marketing salary look modest by comparison. David's phone buzzed in his hand, and he answered it with the desperate eagerness of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Hello? Yes, this is David Mitchell. I've been trying to reach someone about my meeting with Richardson Industries. I watched his face fall as whoever was on the other end delivered what I knew would be more frustrating non-information. The beautiful thing about the system Robert had created was that it gave David just enough hope to keep trying while ensuring that each attempt led nowhere. No, I don't have a different contact number, David said into the phone, his voice rising with frustration. The meeting was supposed to be at 2 o'clock. It's now almost 5, and nobody will tell me what's happening. While David conducted his increasingly fruitless phone call, Jessica continued to study me with the intensity of someone who was beginning to realize that everything she thought she knew might be wrong. Sarah, she said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense. Of course, I replied, settling into one of the lobby's plush armchairs, as if I had all the time in the world for whatever question she wanted to pose. When David and I got together, he said you were struggling financially, that your business was small, that you were living in a tiny apartment that you couldn't afford. She gestured vaguely at my appearance. I tilted my head thoughtfully, as if considering her words for the first time. David said I was struggling financially? He said you were grateful for the divorce settlement, that you didn't ask for much because you knew he was the one with the real earning potential. Jessica's voice was barely audible now, as if she was afraid of the answer she might receive. How interesting, I murmured, watching David pace near the concierge desk while his phone call continued to yield nothing. But frustration. I wonder why he would say that. The question hung between us, loaded with implications that Jessica was clearly beginning to understand. Her face had gone pale, and she kept glancing between me and David, as if seeing both of us clearly for the first time. David ended his call and returned to where we sat, his expression grim. The number goes to a voicemail box that's full. The address I was given doesn't correspond to any business in the city. It's like Richardson Industries doesn't exist. That's very strange, I said sympathetically. Such an important meeting, and now it seems to have vanished into thin air. How frustrating for you. I don't understand what's happening, David continued, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of defeat I remembered from our marriage. This was supposed to save my career. The client specifically requested me for this meeting. The contract was worth 40% of our firm's revenue. I nodded understanding, though of course I knew exactly what was happening because I had orchestrated every detail of his confusion. 40% of Palmer and Associates' revenue? That does sound significant. David's eyes sharpened as he caught something in my tone. How do you know the name of my company? You mentioned it, I replied easily, during one of our phone calls after the divorce. That was true, though what David didn't know was that I had been intimately familiar with Palmer and Associates long before he'd ever worked there. The struggling marketing firm had been on my radar for months as a potential acquisition target, and David's employment there had simply made the eventual takeover more personally satisfying. Jessica's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen with a frown. It's Grace. She's asking when we'll be back because she needs to discuss something important with us. I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Grace Palmer had been instructed to begin raising questions about the sustainability of David and Jessica's living arrangements at precisely this moment, when David's career crisis would make him most vulnerable to additional pressure. Your aunt has been very generous, I commented to Jessica, letting you stay in her guest house while you look for a permanent place. That kind of family support is wonderful. Jessica's expression grew more troubled. Yes, she has been generous. Almost too generous, really. Sometimes I wonder... Wonder what? David asked, momentarily distracted from his business crisis by the tone in Jessica's voice. Nothing, Jessica said quickly, but I could see the doubt growing in her eyes. She was beginning to question the convenient timing of Grace's hospitality, the luxurious accommodations that seemed beyond what a real estate developer could reasonably offer, the way every aspect of their new life together had fallen into place with suspicious ease. My phone chimed with a text message, and I glanced at it with the kind of casual attention that suggested routine business rather than emergency communication. In reality, it was an update from Robert confirming that the next phase of David's education was ready to begin. "Well," I said, rising from my chair with fluid grace, "I should let you both get back to resolving your meeting situation. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for the confusion." David looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "Sarah, wait. I know this is awkward, asking for your help after everything that's happened between us, but you have any contacts in Los Angeles? Anyone who might be able to help me track down this client?" The irony of the moment was breathtaking. David was asking his ex-wife, whom he believed to be financially struggling and professionally limited, to help him navigate a business crisis in a city where I owned more commercial real estate than he could imagine. "I might know some people," I said thoughtfully. "The hospitality industry is quite connected, you know. Let me make a few calls and see what I can find out." David's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Sarah. I know I don't deserve your help, but this could be the difference between saving my career and losing everything." I reached into my handbag and withdrew a business card, though not the one David expected. Instead of the simple white card with basic contact information that he would have associated with a small travel planning business, I handed him a heavy, cardstock rectangle with embossed lettering and the kind of sophisticated design that suggested serious corporate backing. David stared at the card as if it were written in a foreign language. "Mitchell Hospitality Holdings," he read aloud. "Chief Executive Officer." "That's my company," I said simply, watching his face transform as the implications began to sink. And Jessica leaned over to look at the card, her eyes widening as she processed what she was seeing. "CEO? Sarah, you're a CEO?" "Among other things," I replied with the understatement of the century. "We're a fairly large operation. Hotels, resorts, travel services, that sort of thing. I'm sure we can find someone who knows about Richardson Industries." David's hands were shaking as he held the business card. "How large?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Oh, we have properties in 12 states, I said casually, as if discussing the weather. "About 15,000 employees, I believe. The numbers change so frequently it's hard to keep track." The lobby around us seemed to fade as David and Jessica absorbed this information. Everything they thought they knew about me, about our marriage, about the reasons for our divorce, was crumbling in real time as they tried to reconcile the modest travel planner David had described with the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar hospitality empire. 15,000 employees, Jessica repeated, her voice hollow with shock. "Give or take," I confirmed. "We're always hiring. It's a growth industry, you know. People love to travel, and they're willing to pay for exceptional experiences." David sank into the nearest chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. "You own hotels?" "Quite a few," I said, gesturing around the Beverly Hills Hotel's opulent lobby. "This one, for instance, we acquired it 2 years ago. Beautiful property, don't you think?" The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He was sitting in a hotel lobby owned by his ex-wife, the woman he had left because he didn't think she was successful enough to match his ambitions. The woman who had paid for his plane tickets because he couldn't afford them was actually wealthy enough to buy the entire airline if she chose to. "The guest house where we're staying," Jessica said slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Grace said it was part of her real estate portfolio." I nodded encouragingly. "Grace Palmer is one of our property managers, excellent at her job. She's been with the company for 7 years now, I believe." Jessica's face went white as she understood the full scope of what had been happening. "She works for you," Grace works for you." "She does indeed," I confirmed. "Very reliable employee. She's been keeping me updated on how you've been settling in." David's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "You've been watching us." "Watching is a strong word," I said gently. "I've been aware of your situation, certainly. When my property manager mentioned that my ex-husband was staying in one of our guest houses with his new girlfriend, naturally, I was curious about how you were adjusting to your new life. The beautiful thing about the truth was how completely it recontextualized everything that had happened since David left me. Every convenience he had attributed to Jessica's family connections, every stroke of good fortune that had smoothed their path, every advantage he thought he had gained by leaving his unsuccessful wife had actually been provided by the woman he had underestimated so catastrophically. "The job interviews Jessica had lined up," David said, his voice cracking with the weight of realization. "The ones that fell through at the last minute. I thought she should focus on understanding her new relationship before taking on additional responsibilities," I explained. "Employment can be so time-consuming when you're trying to build a life with someone." Jessica made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You've been controlling everything." "I've been observing," I corrected, "and occasionally making suggestions through appropriate channels. I wanted to see how you both handled success, how you treated each other when you thought you were getting everything you wanted." David finally found his voice again. "The meeting today. Richardson Industries." "There is no Richardson Industries," I said gently. "There's just a series of phone numbers and addresses that lead nowhere, designed to bring you to Los Angeles at exactly this moment so we could have this conversation." The silence that followed was deafening. David and Jessica sat frozen, their minds racing to process the magnitude of what they had just learned. Everything they had believed about me, about themselves, about their relationship, had been revealed as an elaborate illusion constructed by the woman they had dismissed as inconsequential. "Why?" David finally whispered. "Why would you do this to us?" I looked at him with something that might have been compassion. "Because I needed to know who you really were, David. And now I do." On Part 7. The question hung in the Beverly Hills hotel lobby like smoke from an extinguished flame. David stared at me with eyes that held a mixture of betrayal, confusion, and the dawning horror of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "You needed to know who I really was?" he repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sarah, we were married for 5 years. You knew who I was." I settled back into the plush armchair, crossing my legs with the kind of composed elegance that comes from years of conducting high-stakes business negotiations. The marble lobby stretched around us, filled with the quiet conversations of people who wielded real power in the world, providing the perfect backdrop for David's education about the difference between authentic success and the illusion he had been chasing. "I thought I did," I replied, my voice gentle but firm. "When we got married, I believed you were the kind of man who would grow with success, who would become more generous and humble as opportunities expanded. I was wrong." Jessica shifted in her chair, her designer knockoff handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. "What do you mean, grow with success?" David was always ambitious. "Ambition isn't the same as character," I explained, watching David's face as he began to understand the test he had been failing for years. When David started getting promotions at Palmer & Associates, when our joint bank account began growing, when he gained access to exclusive social circles, I watched carefully to see what kind of person success would reveal him to be. David's sigh. Hands were trembling as he held my business card, the embossed lettering catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. "You were testing me?" "I was hoping," I corrected. "Hoping that prosperity would make you kinder, more appreciative, more aware of how fortunate we were, Instead, it made you arrogant, dismissive, and convinced that you were the sole architect of our good fortune. The truth of those words settled over David like a weight he couldn't escape. I could see him remembering the conversations we'd had during our marriage, the times he'd dismissed my opinions, the way he'd gradually stopped including me in financial decisions, the condescending tone he'd adopted when discussing my little travel business. Every promotion you received at Palmer & Associates was arranged by me, I continued, my voice steady and factual. Every major client that came to your firm was directed there by my connections. Every networking opportunity that advanced. Your career was orchestrated through my business relationships. David's face had gone ashen. That's impossible. Palmer & Associates was failing when I started steering clients their way, I said, opening my phone to show him financial documents that painted a clear picture of the marketing firm's trajectory. Their biggest accounts were hemorrhaging. Money, their creative team was outdated, and they were 6 months away from bankruptcy when I began what you might call a rescue operation. Jessica leaned forward to look at the numbers on my screen, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she realized the implications. You saved his company? I saved his job, I corrected. The company was a means to an end. I wanted to see what David would do with success, how he would treat the people around him when he thought he had earned power through his own merit. The lobby's ambient noise seemed to fade as David absorbed this information. Guests moved through the space around us, conducting their own business with the quiet confidence of people who understood their place in the world's power structure. David was learning that his place was not what he had believed it to be. Clients who specifically requested me for projects, David said slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with devastating clarity. The ones who made my reputation at the firm. All subsidiaries of Mitchell Hospitality Holdings, I confirmed. We needed marketing services for our expansion into new markets. Rather than hiring an outside agency, I decided to test whether my husband could handle the responsibility of real success. Jessica's voice was barely audible. He failed the test. I looked at her with something approaching sympathy. He began treating me like an obstacle to his ambitions rather than a partner in our shared success. He stopped consulting me about financial decisions, started making social plans without including me, and began introducing me to his colleagues as just a travel planner, while positioning himself as the household's primary breadwinner. David's phone buzzed, and he answered it automatically, his movements mechanical as he struggled to process what he was learning. Hello? Yes, this is David Mitchell. I watched his expression change as he listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. When he hung up, his face had gone completely white. That was Mark Stevens, he said, his voice hollow. Palmer & Associates just lost 3 major accounts. The clients are terminating their contracts effective immediately. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, though of course I had instructed Robert to begin withdrawing Mitchell Hospitality Holdings business from the marketing firm at precisely this moment. That must be very stressful for you. Jessica's eyes darted between David and me as the implications became clear. The accounts that are leaving, she said slowly. They're your companies, aren't they? Business relationships change, I replied, diplomatically. Sometimes it's necessary to explore new partnerships when current arrangements no longer serve everyone's interests. David stared at me with an expression of complete devastation. You're destroying my career. I'm revealing the reality of your career, I corrected gently. The success you thought you had earned was always dependent on my support. I'm simply withdrawing that support to see what remains. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman in an expensive business suit who approached our seating area with confident strides. I recognized her immediately as Amanda Torres, one of my executive assistants who had been coordinating the Los Angeles aspects of this revelation. Ms. Mitchell, Amanda said with professional courtesy, Your car is ready for the airport. Your flight to Chicago departs in 2 hours. I stood gracefully, gathering my handbag and the tablet I had been using to show David the financial documents that were reshaping his understanding of reality. Thank you, Amanda. Please let Robert know that the Los Angeles meetings concluded successfully. David looked up at me with something approaching panic. You're leaving? Sarah, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out what happens next. What happens next is up to you, I replied, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years making decisions that affected thousands of lives. You can continue chasing illusions of success that were never real, or you can begin the difficult work of building something authentic. Jessica finally found her voice again. What about us? David and me, I mean. What happens to our relationship? I looked at her with genuine curiosity. What do you think should happen? You entered into a relationship with a married man because you believed he represented financial security and social advancement. Now you've learned that every advantage you thought he possessed was actually provided by the wife he left behind. Does that change how you feel about him? The question hung in the air between them, exposing the transactional nature of their relationship in a way that made both of them visibly uncomfortable. Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she realized that her attraction to David had been based on assumptions about his success that had just been revealed as completely false. I thought he was going places, she whispered. I thought being with him would give me opportunities I couldn't create on my own. And now? I asked, though I could see the answer in her expression. Now I don't know what to think. David reached for Jessica's hand, but she pulled away from him instinctively. The gesture was small, but definitive, marking the moment when their relationship began to crumble under the weight of revealed truth. Jessica, please, David said, desperation creeping into his voice. This doesn't change how I feel about you. We can work through this. Work through what? Jessica asked, her voice rising with emotion. Work through the fact that you left your wife because you thought I was a better opportunity? Work through the fact that everything you told me about your success was a lie? Work through the fact that the woman you claimed was holding you back was actually the one making everything possible? I watched their relationship dissolve in real time, each word they exchanged revealing another crack in the foundation of assumptions they had built their future on. It was both heartbreaking and inevitable, the natural consequence of choices made for the wrong reasons. My phone chimed with a message from Robert. Palmer & Associates stock has dropped 12% since the account withdrawals were announced. Mark Stevens is requesting an emergency meeting with any remaining major clients. I showed the message to David, who read it with the expression of someone watching his professional life collapse in real time. This is happening because of you, he said, his voice thick with accusation. This is happening because of choices you made, I replied calmly. You chose to leave our marriage. You chose to pursue Jessica because you thought her family connections would advance your career. You chose to build your sense of success on foundations that were never solid. Amanda cleared her throat discreetly, reminding me that my flight schedule was non-negotiable. I gathered my things and prepared to leave David and Jessica to confront the wreckage of their assumptions. There is one more thing you should know, I said, pausing before I left. The divorce settlement you thought was so generous? The house sale proceeds you believed represented your share of our marital assets? All of that money was already mine. The condo, the investments, the savings accounts you thought we were splitting equally were funded by Mitchell Hospitality, holdings from the beginning. David's mouth fell open as the final piece of his financial reality became clear. I don't have anything. You have exactly what you brought to our marriage, I said with finality. Your marketing skills, your personality, and your ambition. What you choose to build with those assets now will be entirely up to you. I walked away from them across the marble lobby, my heels clicking with the authority of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. Behind me, I could hear the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a very difficult conversation between two people who were finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. As I stepped into the California sunshine where my car waited, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The test I had designed for David was complete, and the results were exactly what I had expected. He had failed to recognize real partnership when he had it, had mistaken support for weakness, and had confused authentic success with the illusion of power. Now he would have the opportunity to discover what he could achieve entirely on his own merit. It was a chance many people never got, and I genuinely hoped he would use it wisely. The car pulled away from the Beverly Hills Hotel, carrying me toward the airport and the flight that would return me to Chicago and the empire I had built while David chased shadows. In a few hours, I would be back in my real office, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Mitchell Hospitality Holdings continuing to thrive and expand. David and Jessica would figure out their own way forward, but they would do it with complete clarity about the reality of their situation. Sometimes the most valuable gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it's painful to receive. Part 8. The flight back to Chicago gave me time to reflect on the afternoon's revelations and their inevitable consequences. Seated once again, in first class, I reviewed the messages that had been accumulating on my phone as David and Jessica's world imploded in real time behind me. Robert had sent a comprehensive update on Palmer and Associates' deteriorating situation. 3 major accounts terminated as planned. Mark Stevens called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. David's position is now untenable. Grace Palmer had texted about the situation at the guest house. Jay returned alone, packing her belongings, asked for help finding a new place to live. Dee still in Los Angeles, unclear about his return plans. Amanda Torres had provided a report on David's activities after I left the hotel. Subject spent 40 minutes in the lobby making phone calls. Appeared to be attempting to reach various business contacts. Most calls went to voicemail. Eventually left the hotel on foot. Destination unknown. I closed my phone and gazed out at the clouds drifting past the airplane window, thinking about the test I had designed and the results it had produced. For months, I had given David every opportunity to recognize the support system that had made his success possible, to appreciate the partnership he had taken for granted, to demonstrate the kind of character that could have saved our marriage. Instead, he had interpreted my quiet strength as weakness, my behind-the-scenes work as insignificance, and my love as something he could discard when a more attractive option presented itself. The education he had received in Los Angeles was harsh but necessary, the kind of lesson that could only be learned through direct experience of consequences. The flight attendant offered me champagne, which I accepted while considering what would happen next. David would return to Chicago eventually, probably within the next day or two, to find that his professional life had collapsed and his personal life had dissolved. Jessica would be gone. Grace would no longer maintain the fiction of being her wealthy aunt, and the comfortable illusions that had sustained him for months would be replaced by the stark reality of his actual circumstances. Part of me felt genuine sympathy for what he was going through. Despite everything that had happened between us, I had loved David once, had seen potential in him that I had hoped would flourish under the right conditions. The man I had married had been ambitious, but not cruel, confident but not arrogant, eager for success but not willing to sacrifice his integrity to achieve it. Success had changed him. Or perhaps it had simply revealed aspects of his character that had been hidden during our early years together when his circumstances were more modest. Either way, the David who had left me for Jessica Palmer was not the same person I had fallen in love with, and the test I had designed had confirmed that transformation in ways that left no room for doubt. My phone buzzed with a call from James Morrison, the CEO of one of our subsidiary companies who had been coordinating some of the Los Angeles arrangements. Sarah, the situation is proceeding as planned. David's attempts to contact our fictional client have stopped, and he's made no effort to reach out to you directly. Good, I replied, appreciating James's thoroughness in managing the details. What about Palmer and Associates? How is Mark Stevens handling the crisis? Not well, James reported with satisfaction. He's called 3 emergency meetings in the past 6 hours. The remaining staff are updating their resumes, and there are rumors that the company will be dissolved within the month. I felt a pang of regret for the innocent employees who would be affected by David's situation, but Palmer and Associates had been a failing company long before I had started steering business their way. If anything, my intervention had extended its life by several years, giving its employees time to develop skills and build portfolios that would serve them well in their next positions. Make sure our Human Resources Department reaches out to any Palmer and Associates employees who might be interested in positions with our companies, I instructed. We shouldn't punish people for their employer's poor judgment. Already handled, James confirmed. We've identified several promising candidates, particularly in their creative department. They'll have opportunities with us if they're interested. That was one of the things I appreciated about running a large company. We could afford to be generous with people who found themselves in difficult circumstances through no fault of their own, offering them chances to rebuild their careers within our organization. David's situation was different because his difficulties were the direct result of choices he had made, but there was no reason for his colleagues to suffer for his mistakes. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, I thought about the conversation David and I would eventually need to have. He would want explanations, justifications, perhaps even an opportunity to apologize and try to repair what had been broken between us. The question was whether such a conversation would serve any useful purpose for either of us. The truth was that our marriage had been over the moment David decided that Jessica Palmer represented a better future than the partnership we had built together. Everything that had happened since then had simply been the natural consequences of that decision playing out over time. The test I had designed hadn't destroyed our relationship. It had revealed that the relationship was already destroyed, killed, by David's ambition and his inability to recognize the value of what he already possessed. O'Hare Airport was busy with the usual evening traffic as my plane touched down and taxied to the gate. I gathered my belongings and prepared to return to the life I had built while David chased illusions of success. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new deals to negotiate and new properties to acquire, new ways to expand the empire that David had never suspected existed. But first, there would be the aftermath of today's revelations to manage. David would eventually return to Chicago, Jessica would need to find a new place to live, and Palmer and Associates would continue its spiral toward dissolution. These situations would require careful handling to ensure that the lessons being learned were as clear and lasting as possible. My driver met me at baggage claim with the kind of professional efficiency that had become routine over the years. As we drove through Chicago's evening traffic toward my real apartment, not the modest Lincoln Park space David knew about, but the penthouse in Millennium Tower that served as my actual residence, I reviewed the messages that had continued to accumulate throughout my flight. Victoria Chen, my head of public relations, had sent a draft press release announcing my emergence from the anonymity I had maintained for years. Mitchell Hospitality Holdings CEO Sarah Mitchell to make first public appearance at industry conference next month. The story would position my previous privacy as a strategic choice, rather than an attempt to hide from an ex-husband who had never bothered to investigate my real circumstances. Robert had confirmed that David's attempts to reach me directly had begun. 7 missed calls in the past 2 hours. No voicemails yet, but suspect he's working up the courage to leave a message. Grace Palmer had provided an update on Jessica's situation. Finished packing. Asked me directly if I really was her aunt or if I worked for you. Told her the truth. She took it better than expected. Said she'd suspected something wasn't right for weeks. I appreciated Jessica's honesty in that moment. It took courage to confront the reality of a situation that had been too convenient to be entirely believable. and her willingness to face the truth spoke well of her character. She had made a mistake in getting involved with a married man, but she hadn't deserved to be deceived about the circumstances she was entering into. As we pulled up to the Millennium Tower, I made a decision about how to handle the immediate aftermath of David's education. He would need time to process what he had learned, to come to terms with the complete reversal of his understanding of our relationship and his own circumstances. Pushing him for immediate conversations or decisions would only make the situation more difficult for everyone involved. Instead, I would give him space to absorb the reality of his situation while I returned to the business of running my company. When he was ready to have a mature conversation about what had happened and what it meant for both of our futures, he would know how to reach me. The penthouse elevator rose silently toward my floor, carrying me back to the life I had maintained. Throughout our marriage, while playing the role of the modest travel planner who was grateful for David's success, the apartment was exactly as I had left it, filled with art and furniture that David had never seen, overlooking the city where I employed thousands of people who had no idea their ultimate boss had spent the afternoon systematically dismantling her ex-husband's illusions. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over Chicago's glittering skyline. Somewhere down there, David was probably still in Los Angeles, trying to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage of his assumptions. In a few days, he would return to find that Jessica had moved out, Palmer and Associates was closing, and the comfortable life he had built was revealed as a house of cards that had finally collapsed. It was a harsh lesson, but it was also a necessary one. David had needed to understand the difference between earned success and borrowed privilege, between authentic achievement and the illusion of power. The test I had designed had taught him that lesson in the most direct way possible. Now it was up to him to decide what he would do with the knowledge he had gained. He could spend his energy being angry about the deception, or he could use this opportunity to build something real and lasting based on his own genuine abilities. The choice was entirely his to make. My phone rang, displaying David's number on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, not ready for that conversation yet. When we finally talked, it would be on my terms, after he had had sufficient time to fully understand what had happened and why it had been necessary. For now, I had a company to run and a life to live, free from the burden of pretending to be less than I was. The test was complete, the results were clear, and the future was mine to determine. Part 9. The next morning brought a cascade of developments that confirmed the comprehensive nature of David's education. I sat in my real office, 60 floors above Chicago, reviewing the reports that painted a complete picture of how quickly illusions could crumble when their foundations were removed. Robert entered with his usual morning briefing, though today's updates were more dramatic than our typical business discussions. Palmer and Associates filed for bankruptcy protection at 8 a.m., he reported, settling into the chair across from my desk. Mark Stevens released a statement blaming the loss of major accounts for the company's inability to meet its financial obligations. I nodded, unsurprised by the speed of the firm's collapse. How many employees are affected? 47. Total, Robert replied, consulting his tablet. Our HR department has already reached out to 31 of them with potential opportunities within our organization. The response has been positive. That was important to me. While David's situation was the result of choices he had made, his colleagues shouldn't suffer unnecessarily for his poor judgment. Mitchell Hospitality Holdings was large enough to absorb talented people who found themselves unemployed through no fault of their own. What about David himself? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Still in Los Angeles as far as we can determine, Robert said. No return flight booked, no hotel charges beyond yesterday, no significant financial activity. He seems to be processing. I could imagine David wandering the streets of Los Angeles, trying to come to terms with the complete reversal of his understanding of reality. Everything he had believed about his success, his relationship with Jessica, even his marriage to me, had been revealed as fundamentally different from what he had assumed. That kind of psychological shock required time to absorb. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace Palmer. "Jessica moved out this morning. Left a note thanking me for my honesty and asking me to tell you she's sorry for her part in what happened. Seems genuinely remorseful. I appreciated that gesture. Jessica's involvement in the breakdown of my marriage had been painful, but she had been operating on incomplete information about David's circumstances and my own situation. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistake and express genuine remorse spoke well of her character." 3 weeks after the Los Angeles revelation, David finally returned to Chicago. I learned of his arrival not through any direct communication, but through the network of information that flows naturally through a city when you own as much of it as I do. He had taken a Greyhound bus, spending 3 days crossing the country, with whatever money remained in his personal account after his professional life collapsed. The man who stepped off that bus at Union Station was fundamentally different from the confident marketing executive who had left me for what he thought was a better opportunity. Gone was the swagger that had carried him through social events, where he positioned himself as the successful breadwinner. Missing was the condescending tone he had adopted when discussing my supposedly modest achievements. What remained was someone who had been stripped of his illusions and forced to confront the reality of his actual circumstances. I was in my office reviewing acquisition reports when Maria Santos knocked and entered with an expression that suggested important news. "David Mitchell is in the lobby," she announced quietly. "He's asking to see you." I had been expecting this moment for weeks, though I hadn't been certain when or how it would arrive. David's pride had always been one of his defining characteristics, and I knew it would take time for him to swallow enough of it to request a meeting with the ex-wife whose true identity he had spent years failing to recognize. "How does he seem?" I asked, genuinely curious about his mental state after weeks of processing the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Humbled," Maria replied without hesitation. "Tired. Different from how I remember him from the company events during your marriage." I stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, considering how to handle this conversation. David deserved the opportunity to speak his piece, to ask the questions that had undoubtedly been consuming him since Los Angeles. But this meeting would also set the tone for whatever relationship, if any, we would have going forward. "Send him up," I decided, "but make sure security is aware. This conversation could go in several directions." Maria nodded and left to make the arrangements. I spent the next few minutes preparing myself emotionally for what promised to be a difficult encounter. Despite everything that had happened between us, David had been an important part of my life for 5 years. Seeing him broken and defeated would bring me no joy, even though his current circumstances were the direct result of choices he had made. The elevator chimed softly as David arrived on the executive floor. Through my office's glass walls, I watched him emerge into the reception area, looking around with the expression of someone who was seeing his surroundings clearly for the first time. The Mitchell Hospitality Holdings corporate headquarters was impressive by any standard. All marble and steel and understated elegance that spoke of serious money and genuine power. David had never set foot in this building during our marriage, had never asked where I spent my days or shown curiosity about the business empire I was quietly constructing. His lack of interest in my professional life had been one of the early warning signs that our relationship was built on assumptions rather than genuine understanding. Maria escorted him to my office door, then withdrew discreetly to give us privacy for what promised to be an emotionally charged conversation. David stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the executive suite that represented everything he had failed to recognize about the woman he had married. "Hello, David," I said, remaining seated behind my desk but gesturing to the chairs, arranged for visitors. "Please, come in." He entered slowly, his eyes moving from the expensive artwork on the walls to the awards and recognitions displayed on built-in shelves, to the view of the city that stretched beyond the windows. Everything in the room spoke of sustained success and genuine achievement. the kind of authentic power that he had always claimed to want, but had never recognized when it was right in front of him. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 3 weeks," David began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, and I still don't know where to start." "Why don't you start with why you're here?" I suggested, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "What do you hope to accomplish with this meeting?" David sank into one of the visitor chairs, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. The confidence that had once defined his presence had been replaced by a vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and long overdue. "I want to understand," he said simply. "I need to understand how I could have been so completely wrong about everything. About you. About us. About what I thought I was building with Jessica." I leaned back in my chair, considering how much explanation would be helpful versus how much would simply be self-indulgent on my part. David was clearly suffering, but that suffering was also the beginning of whatever growth might be possible for him going forward. "What specifically do you want to understand?" I asked. "Everything," David replied, his voice cracking slightly. "How long have you been running this company? How did I never know? Why did you let me believe I was the successful one in our marriage? Why did you test me instead of just telling me the truth?" The questions tumbled out of him like water from a broken dam, carrying weeks of confusion and self-doubt and desperate need for answers that might make sense of his shattered worldview. "I started Mitchell Hospitality Holdings 12 years ago," I began, deciding that complete honesty was the only approach that would serve either of us. "It began with a bed and breakfast I inherited from my grandmother and grew from there. By the time we got married, I was already running a multi-million-dollar operation." David's face went pale as he absorbed the timeline. "Before we met?" "Before we met," I confirmed. "The travel planning business you knew about was real, but it was essentially a hobby I maintained to stay connected to the industry at a grassroots level. My real work was building this." I gestured around the office, encompassing the empire that surrounded us. "But why hide it?" David asked, genuine anguish in his voice. "Why pretend to be something you weren't?" I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city, while I considered how to explain choices that had seemed logical at the time, but appeared cruel in retrospect. "Initially, it wasn't intentional deception," I said carefully. "When we first started dating, you seemed attracted to what you perceived as my modest success and independent spirit. You said you'd dated too many women who were only interested in wealthy men, and you appreciated that I wasn't impressed by money or status." David winced at the reminder of his earlier words, probably remembering how he had positioned himself as someone who valued substance over superficial success. "As our relationship progressed," I continued, "I began sharing more about my business interests, but you consistently minimized their importance. You assumed my travel connections were limited to budget accommodations and middle-class clients. When I tried to discuss expansion plans or strategic partnerships, you would smile indulgently and suggest I focus on more realistic goals." The memory of those conversations still stung, even after all this time. David had been so convinced of his own superior business acumen that he had dismissed my actual achievements as the fantasies of someone who didn't understand how real success worked. "You made it clear that you saw yourself as the ambitious one in our relationship," I said, turning back to face him. "The one with real potential for significant success. It became easier to let you believe that than to constantly fight for recognition of what I had already achieved." David buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter or some combination of both. I was so arrogant. "Yes," I agreed gently. "You were, but that wasn't the real problem." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What was the real problem?" "The real problem was that success made you cruel," I said. the words carrying the weight of years of accumulated hurt. As your career advanced, as our joint financial situation improved, you became increasingly dismissive of my opinions, increasingly controlling of our shared resources, and increasingly convinced that I should be grateful for your attention. David flinched as if I had struck him, but he didn't argue with my assessment. Perhaps the weeks of reflection had given him enough perspective to recognize the truth in my words. Every promotion you received, every successful campaign you completed, every social connection you made was facilitated by my business network, I continued. But instead of making you more appreciative of our partnership, success made you more convinced that you deserved better than what I could offer. Jessica, David whispered, the name carrying the weight of his ultimate betrayal. Jessica was symptom, not the cause, I said. Your willingness to leave our marriage for what you perceived as a better opportunity revealed everything I needed to know about how you valued our relationship and how you saw me as a person. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of acknowledged truth. David sat motionless in his chair, staring at his hands while processing the complete reversal of his understanding of our marriage and its end. "The test you designed," he finally said, "with Palmer and Associates, with Jessica's aunt, with the Los Angeles meeting. How long were you planning that?" "I started making contingency plans the day you asked for a divorce," I replied honestly. "I wanted to give you every opportunity to demonstrate that leaving me was a mistake, that you could recognize the value of what we had built together. Instead, every choice you made confirmed that you saw me as an obstacle to your success rather than the foundation of it." David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it automatically before looking back at me with fresh anguish. That was a debt collector. I owe money to people I've never heard of for things I can't remember buying. I wasn't surprised. The lifestyle David had been living with Jessica, funded by credit and supported by assumptions about future success that were never realistic, would have created financial obligations that survived the collapse of his illusions. "How much do you owe?" I asked, though I suspected Robert had already provided me with a comprehensive analysis of David's financial situation. "Everything," David said simply. "More than everything. The credit cards, the personal loans, the money I borrowed against my salary from Palmer and Associates. I'm looking at bankruptcy, and even that might not be enough." I returned to my desk and opened the file that Robert had prepared weeks ago, anticipating this conversation. David's financial situation was dire but not irreparable, assuming he was willing to accept the kind of help that would require genuine humility. "I have a proposal for you," I said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Mitchell Hospitality Holdings has a management training program for executives who show potential but need additional development. It's based in Denver, includes a modest salary and basic benefits, and requires a 3-year commitment." David opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the terms of employment that would essentially reset his career to entry level. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to rebuild your professional life based on genuine merit rather than borrowed connections," I corrected. "The position would be challenging, the pay would be significantly less than you're accustomed to, and you would need to prove your value through actual performance rather than networking and charm." "Why?" David asked, looking up at me with confusion. "After everything I've done, why would you help me?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about the man I had married and the lessons that might still be possible for him to learn. "Because the alternative is watching you. Destroy yourself completely," I said. "Because despite everything that's happened between us, I still believe you're capable of becoming the person I thought you were when we first met. And because offering you a path forward serves my interests as well as yours." David's eyebrows rose at that last statement. "How does helping me serve your interests?" "Because having you succeed on your own merit proves that my assessment of your potential was correct, even if my faith in your character was misplaced. I explained. And because watching you fail completely would bring me no satisfaction, only sadness for what we might have built together if you had been willing to see me as a partner rather than a stepping stone. The offer represented genuine opportunity, but it also came with conditions that would require David to fundamentally change his approach to life and work. The salary would cover his basic needs, but nothing more. The location would remove him from the social circles where his reputation had been destroyed. The work itself would demand the kind of authentic effort he had spent years avoiding through charm and connections. "If I take this job," David said slowly, "what happens between us? Do we try to rebuild our relationship, or is this just charity?" I had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about the answer. The truth was complicated and painful for both of us. "Our marriage is over, David," I said gently but firmly. "The test you failed wasn't about whether you would stay faithful to Jessica or return to me. It was about whether you could recognize the value of authentic partnership and genuine success. The fact that you chose to leave our marriage for what you perceived as a better opportunity told me everything I needed to know about how you saw our relationship." David's face crumpled as he absorbed the finality of my words. "So this job? Offer is charity." "It's an opportunity," I corrected. "What you make of it is entirely up to you. If you succeed in Denver, if you prove that you can build something real based on your own abilities, then you'll have accomplished something genuinely meaningful. If you fail, it will be because you chose to fail, not because circumstances were stacked against you." I stood and walked around the desk, stopping in front of David's chair so that we were at eye level for what I knew would be our final serious conversation as former spouses. "I loved you once," I said quietly. "I believed we could build something extraordinary together. That didn't work out, but it doesn't mean I want to see you destroyed. This job offer is my way of giving you a chance to discover who you really are when you're not trying to be someone else." David reached for my hand, but I stepped back gently, maintaining the professional distance that our new relationship required. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for not seeing you, for not appreciating what we had, for throwing it all away because I thought I deserved something better. I'm sorry for being exactly the kind of man you were afraid I might become." "I know you are," I replied, and I meant it. "The question now is whether you're ready to become the kind of man you should have been all along." David signed the employment contract with hands that shook slightly, committing himself to 3 years in Denver, building a career based on actual merit rather than borrowed connections. As he prepared to leave my office, I felt a mixture of closure and sadness that marked the end of one chapter in both of our lives. "David," I called as he reached the door, "the person I married had real potential. I hope you find him again." He nodded without speaking and left, carrying with him the opportunity to rebuild his life on a foundation of genuine achievement rather than illusion. Whether he would succeed or fail was now entirely up to him. I returned to my desk and the quarterly reports that showed Mitchell Hospitality Holdings continuing to thrive and expand. In a few weeks, I would make my first public appearance as the company's CEO, stepping out of the shadows I had maintained for years and taking my place openly among the business leaders who shaped our industry. The test I had designed for David was complete, its lessons delivered with the kind of clarity that could only come from direct experience of consequences. He now understood the difference between earned success and borrowed privilege, between authentic achievement and the illusion of power. What he chose to do with that knowledge would determine the trajectory of the rest of his life. As for me, I had learned lessons of my own. I had discovered that I no longer needed to hide my achievements to protect someone else's ego, that I could command respect and wield power openly rather than through careful manipulation of circumstances. The woman who had played the role of modest travel planner was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to claim her place in the world without apology or explanation. 6 months later, I received a letter from Denver. David's first performance, Review had been exemplary, his supervisors noting his work ethic, humility, and genuine commitment to learning the business from the ground up. He was succeeding, slowly and authentically, building something real for perhaps the first time in his adult life. I filed the letter away and returned to the work of expanding my empire, satisfied that the test had accomplished its purpose. David had learned the lessons he needed to learn. I had discovered the strength to stop hiding my accomplishments, and both of us were finally living authentic lives based on who we really were, rather than who we had pretended to be. Sometimes, the most valuable gift you can give someone is the truth about themselves, even when that truth is painful to receive. David's education had been expensive and traumatic, but it had also been necessary. He was now free to become the person he should have been all along, while I was free to be exactly who I had always been, without apology or concealment. The game was over, the lessons had been learned, and both of us could finally move forward, with clarity about what we had gained and what we had lost in the process. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.